Thank you for joining us today. This is the Weese lecture series here at OU, and we appreciate the wonderful attendance. The Weese lecture series is, for those of you that didn't take part of the afternoon seminar, is actually a series that's an endowed series named after Asa Orrin Weese, an OU professor for about 31 years here at OU, that's recognized as being the primary founder of animal ecology here at the university. So the program's been set up over the years. Obviously, with the pandemic, we haven't been able to bring speakers for several years now, but set up to bring speakers that are leaders in the field of ecology. And so we are very excited to welcome Dr. Joan Roughgarden to join us here at OU, who is exemplifying that exact goal of the program. Dr. Roughgarden received her Bachelor of Science and Bachelor of Arts from the University of Rochester and a PhD from Harvard. She went from there and did a brief stint at the University of Massachusetts before joining the Department of Biology at Stanford for the majority of her career, before retiring as emeritus professor and moving to the university, or moving to Hawaii and being associated with a university as an adjunct faculty member out there. Joan has received a number of awards over the years. Just to name a few: a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She was named a fellow of Stanford University. Numerous awards for working with undergraduates at the university as well. And a career that is really decorated in the field of ecology. In discussing with Joan, just to share a side story, I was really surprised to learn that at 5 years old, she actually was living in Zamboanga in the Philippines, one of the southernmost islands, somewhere I visited as well, which was really neat to learn about. So we were reminiscing about memories of the Philippines. But that early work is what she described as being really influential in developing her love for ecology and tropical island life, which she's gone on to build an amazing career in. And her early works in the 70s and 80s helped to develop the Anolis lizard research program as a model system in community ecology, as well as evolutionary biology. Has also worked with intertidal barnacles, so really diverse research approaches, before some of the recent work that she'll be discussing today. But has really become one of the world's most influential researchers on the theory of sexual selection, or investigating sexual selection, looking at theoretical ecology, field ecology, and evolutionary biology. And so without further ado, please silence your phones and give a warm welcome to Dr. Joan Roughgarden.
Well, thanks so much, Cam. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I think so. Well, it's an enormous pleasure to be here. I don't get to the mainland all that often ever since the pandemic. And it's almost like visiting a different country if you come from Hawaii. And I also, if you had a chance to look, this is a gorgeous floral display here. You know, it's really fabulous, and you might not be able to see it wherever you are, but when you're on your way out, take a look at it. It's really good. So I'd like to thank Larry Weeder, Cam Seiler, and Ari Berkowitz for the invitation to join your Weese endowed lecture this year, and I'm honored to be with you. Now, the first part of this talk reviews some natural variation in gender expression and sexuality that is either not sufficiently known or is problematic for evolutionary biology. And the second part of the talk calls attention to the definition of sexual selection that was developed during a workshop that I organized at NESCENT, the National Center for Evolutionary Thinking, in 2013. And this part of the talk will contrast the definition that my group came up with one recently proposed by David Schuker and Carlotta Corvarnamo. Now, this slide illustrates geckos from Pacific Islands that reproduce asexually. Many species of vertebrates, including lizards and fish, reproduce asexually, and a number of you here work in such systems and are very familiar with that. Now, facultative asexual reproduction occurs in snakes, monitor lizards, birds, and sharks. Asexual reproduction provides an upper bound to the costs of sex that a species should tolerate. For example, if the so-called battle of the sexes becomes sufficiently deleterious, then an evolutionary option, and in some species a behavioral option, is not to bother with sexual reproduction and to reproduce asexually instead. To the contrary, the decision to reproduce sexually is a decision to cooperate, to mix genes rather than to clone. The overarching benefit to sexual reproduction is that the average fitness through time for a sexually reproducing species is higher than that for an asexually reproducing species due to a difference between the arithmetic and geometric mean fitness through time. Thus, sexual reproduction evolved over asexual reproduction to realize a higher long-term fitness in a fluctuating environment. And there's no reason to accept the hypothesis that sex evolved to eliminate bad genes from the gene pool. Sex starts with cooperation. Now, this slide shows a human egg with human sperm, illustrating the size difference between these two types of gametes. The biological definition of male and female, applies to all living things, from seaweeds to sea lions. Namely, a male is an individual that makes solely sperm throughout its life, and a female is an individual that makes solely eggs throughout its life, and a hermaphrodite is an individual that makes both eggs and sperm during its life, either at the same time or at different times. Now, by definition, the sperm is the smaller gamete and the egg is the larger gamete. Therefore, the origin of the distinction between male and female rests with the origin of a size difference between gametes called anisogamy. Anisogamy evolves as a strategy to increase fertilization rates. That is, more gametic contacts occur in seawater when a cloud of large gametes is intersected by a cloud of small gametes, rather than two clouds of medium-sized gametes intersecting each other. There is no reason to accept the hypothesis of some biologists that, quote, males are dependent on females and propagate at their expense, as in a parasite-host relationship, unquote. Or that primordial sexual conflict concerned the origin of anisogamy itself. The origin of male and female does not represent a battle of the gametes. Given the origin of anisogamy, the next conceptual issue is how these gametes are packaged into bodies. Both eggs and sperm together in one body, called hermaphrodism, or eggs in one body and sperm in another body type called diece. A simultaneous hermaphrodite produces both eggs and sperm at the same time. A sequential hermaphrodite produces eggs and sperm at different times. Sequential hermaphrodites come in two varieties: male first, then female, and female first, then male. Sequential hermaphrodites therefore change sex during life. That means, by definition, that they transition from making sperm to making eggs and vice versa, or vice versa. Furthermore, some fish multiply switch, for example, changing from juvenile to male to female and back to male, and in each case, changing the size of the gametes that they make. Most plants are hermaphroditic. Only about 6% of plant species have separate sexes. In contrast, most animals have separate sexes. Only 6% of all animal species are hermaphroditic. On the left are blue-headed wrasses, a species with some individuals who change from female to male. In the middle are clownfish, a species with some individuals who change from male to female. And on the right are hamlets, a species with individuals who are simultaneously male and female. Hamlets do not self-fertilize, and the figure depicts the mating dance, wherein one fish releases eggs and the other releases sperm. Then they turn over and reverse roles. Hermaphrodism is the primitive condition, and dioecy is derived, although in some lineages and some ecological conditions, dioecy reverts back to hermaphrodism. Generally speaking, the advantage to evolving away from having both eggs and sperm in the same body versus having specialized carriers of sperm and eggs is efficiency in locating partners. Now, in fish, the parental care of eggs is usually provided by males. On the bottom is a pipefish from a group whose tubular bodies resemble a flute. In pipefish, the males glue the fertilized eggs to their bellies while they swim around. Seahorses are derived from pipefish. In seahorses, the males have a skin flap on their bellies into which males deposit their eggs, causing the male to become, so to speak, pregnant. As a result, females in some seahorse species can produce eggs faster than males can give birth to the eggs they are incubating. Hence, the females can mate with more males than males can mate with females, so that the males become choosy and the females promiscuous, so-called sex role reversal. Sex role reversal is theoretically important because it demonstrates ipso facto that there is no necessary connection between gamete size and sex role. A common narrative from a branch of evolutionary theory called sexual selection is that males are, quote, passionate and females, quote, coy, to use Darwin's unfortunate terms. Sexual selection theory posits that males with their cheap sperm can afford to play around, whereas females with their expensive eggs stand to lose their reproductive investment if they mate with a genetically inferior male. But sex role reversed species demonstrate that either sex can be promiscuous or choosy, regardless of gamete size, thereby invalidating sexual selection's claim of a necessary connection between gamete size and sex role. Now, an anglerfish is about the size of a golf ball and named because of the bait-like tassel at the end of a front-facing dorsal spine. Let's see if this thing works. Yeah, you see the tassel up here. And the fish depicted is a female. The bumps on its bottom are males. So that's these things down here. And they are physically attached to the female, and in some species are connected with the female's blood circulatory system. One female mated with multiple males is called polyandry. Dwarf males illustrate the ultimate in a male who brings only his sperm to the mating. So these then are dwarf males here. If all males, like anglerfish males, were to bring no more than heat-seeking ballistic testes, then they too would be dwarf males. The fact that males are generally whole organisms themselves, rather than accessories carried by the females, implies that males do bring more than their genes and invites the interpretation that some element of cooperation that they bring some element of cooperation to offspring production. Now the top shows photos I took at a zoo in Holland of females from a species of South American spider monkey. Notice the structure resembling a penis. This is called a pendulous clitoris. It is used to signal reproductive condition by delivering urinary and/or vaginal secretions. The bottom panel shows the tip of a penis lodged in the genital canal of a male whale. Male whales and porpoises do not possess a penis and scrotum dangling outside the body. The testes remain within the body cavity. The variously shaped genital organisms show that reproductive organs are more than conduits for gametes. Can animals have gender, or is gender reserved for humans? I take gender to mean the morphology, behavior, and life history of a sexed body. A sexed body is a body classified with respect to the size of the gametes produced. Now, for species in which most males have certain traits, and most males have other traits, most females have other traits, a few males will be found to have female traits, and a few females to have male traits. This situation allows for what has been termed transgender animals. The best studied example occurs in sun angel hummingbird species from the Andes. Male sun angel hummingbirds have colorful feathers on their throats called a gorget, as illustrated in the slide. A female with a gorget is referred to as a, quote, masculine female. It also has a comparatively shorter bill. Conversely, quote, feminine males, unquote, also exist with a longer bill. Males use their gorgets in territorial defense of the common short flowers that fit short bills. Masculine females, like the males, can defend the territories of short flowers. Conversely, the feminine males have longer bills than the masculine males, and feminine males use different flowers from the masculine males, namely relatively rare long tubular flowers that do not need to be defended. So what is theoretically important is that gender expression indicates occupation, and transgender birds are those whose occupation crosses over into the occupation typical of the other gender. Now this slide illustrates ruffs, a European shorebird species with 3 male genders and 1 female gender. The left panel shows the male gender with a dark ruff. The top middle panel shows the male gender with a white ruff, and the bottom middle panel shows the female and the right panel shows the male gender with no ruff, and the bottom middle panel shows a female also with no ruff. Now, ruffs mate in leks, which are places where males congregate to attract females. The black-ruffed males defend small courts within the lect, within which each displays to visiting females. The white-ruffed males do not defend courts and instead keep company with the females as they feed away from the lek. When a white-ruffed male is nearby and a black-ruffed male is alone in a court, a black-ruffed male dances to invite the white-ruffed males to join him on his court. Females who later arrive at the lek prefer to mate with a black-white team of males rather than with only a black-ruffed male. Ruffs illustrate gender multiplicity in animals. 2 sexes does not imply 2 genders. The lower right illustrates a black-ruffed male mating with a ruffless male, a mating that is homosexual but heterogenderal. Now this slide, which I took in 2018 during a safari to South Africa, illustrates two male elephants mating. And you can see pretty obviously here that they are male. And charismatic megavertebrates often feature same-sex mating, as do over 100 bird species. Now, this slide shows male-male mating in rams and lions. The sequence at the top right, so they're the rams. So then the sequence over here for lions was given to me by a Brazilian photojournalist who took these slides while on vacation in the Serengeti. They show one male lion soliciting a mating from another male and then proceeding to a male-male mating. And the bottom two photos show that same-sex mating in lions occurs in the presence of a female. Now, bonobos are our closest living primate relatives, as shown in the tree down here at the lower left. So these are humans up here, and these are bonobos right next to them. And these are a bunch of whole other types of primates. So we are really close to these things. And in August 2021, I visited the Appenhal Zoo in Holland to photograph bonobos. The top slide shows the bonobo habitat at the zoo. The bonobos spend the night in the structure at the top left, way over here. That's where they spend the night. Each morning, the zookeeper in the center bottom distributes food, and then the bonobos enter their structure to forage for food, as shown in the lower right. The top left shows the clitoris of a subadult bonobo. The placement of the clitoris supports a form of same-sex mating called GG rubbing, or genital-genital rubbing, where the females rub their clitorises with each other, leading to orgasm accompanied with squeals of pleasure. To alleviate conflict over food that has been scattered by the employee over the habitat, to alleviate conflict over the food scattered across the habitat, the females carry out lots of same-sex mating in various positions. The top right is face-to-face lying down. The bottom left is face-to-face sitting up. The bottom right is back-to-back. The top left and center illustrate still more female-female mating positions, back to front and genital touching. Female bonobos could write their own Kama Sutra. Lest one think that bonobo behavior is irrelevant to human experience, the diagram at the top right is the primate family tree extending to humans. Bonobos, along with the common chimp, are our closest living primate relatives, as I previously mentioned. The bottom left is the famous 1974 specimen of Australopithecus afarensis, known as Lucy. Notice the head size and height agree with the bonobo, but Lucy is more bipedal. The lower right shows a hominin family tree illustrating how the genus Australopithecus gave rise to the modern genus Homo. There is speculation in the literature that the placement of the human clitoris might reflect its evolutionarily prior use in female-female mating, a morphological configuration that I term the mark of Sappho. Now, there is widespread occurrence of same-sex mating in animals, and this is no longer news to biologists. But what to make of it is not so clear. In my view, same-sex mating belongs together with many forms of affiliative behavior, including mutual grooming in mammals, mutual preening in birds, and excess heterosexual mating, as shown in the slide. These behaviors all of them lead to a mutual exchange of physical pleasure. Making a big deal about same-sex mating reflects Western culture's fetishizing of sex. The theoretical interest lies with the entire suite of mutually affiliated behaviors, not solely with same-sex mating. And I've proposed that affiliative behaviors underwrite cooperation. Carrying out cooperation requires coordination of activity. And the act of cooperation itself might have evolved to be pleasurable. So how to interpret affiliative behavior and mating behavior in general brings us to the topic of sexual selection. Now, sexual selection theory is widely known in connection with the peacock's tail. These are supposed to result from peahens selecting mates with gaudy tails that signify genetic quality. In 2006, in a science article with Errol Ache and Miko Oishi, as well as in later publications, I've argued that sexual selection theory should be completely abandoned as an explanatory framework in evolutionary biology. My view is illustrated at the top of the slide, wherein what was originally a possibly useful hypothesis to explain the evolution of male ornaments, such as the peacock's tail, that this theory has now morphed over the years into a bloated and unfalsifiable doctrine of natural conflict, deceit, and sex stereotypes. Today's sexual selection doctrine is as useless to scientific progress as a 3-pound, $5,000 Swiss Army knife is to carpentry. To develop a constructive way forward, in 2013, I organized a workshop with 34 participants at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, known for short as NESCENT, in Durham, North Carolina, to assess the state of sexual selection studies and to suggest future directions. A miniature of the workshop's report is at the bottom left. You're not supposed to read this or that. That's a miniature of a page. So a miniature of the workshop's report is at the bottom left. A remarkable finding was that participants could not agree on the definition of sexual selection. Therefore, a subcommittee of participants developed a definition as discussed later. Then in 2021, David Schuker and Carlotta Kavarnamo reviewed the definition of sexual selection in the journal Behavioral Ecology. And that's this miniature over here. Now, their article confirms the NESCENT finding that no generally accepted definition of sexual selection exists. The miniature on the bottom right presents a full page from the Schuker and Kavarnamo article that in the journal was typeset in fine print and shows the many definitions of sexual selection presently in use. And Schuker and Kavarnamo presented their own definition that I'll now contrast with the NESCENT definition. So Schuker and Kavarnamo write, quote, "Our main aim in writing this paper is to allow the next generation of sexual selection researchers to address the many questions still left unanswered without the baggage of the definition of sexual selection left lying around." Well, I agree with this aspiration and thank David Schuker and Carlotta Kavarnamo for their constructive contribution. The NESCENT definition and the Schuker-Kavarnamo definition, hereafter abbreviated the SK definition, agree on two main points. First, the long-standing association of sexual selection with sex roles and ornaments, including a relation of gamete size to sex role, is discredited and jettisoned once and for all by both them and us. Both definitions are sex neutral. So this is huge. Second, the definitions agree that a distinction is needed between sexual selection and the fertility component of natural selection. The Nescent and SK definitions do not formulate this distinction in exactly the same terms, but the intent seems similar. The Nescent report explains the definition in this way, the distinction in this way. If a female chooses one male over another solely because of his color, without any impact on egg production, then sexual selection occurs. Okay. Alternatively, suppose the number of eggs a female lays depends on resources provided by a male. Then if a female chooses one male over another because of the quantity of resources he supplies, then both fertility selection and sexual selection occur together. Both male and female prosper from the increased egg production. And additionally, the male prospers because of being selected over males supplying fewer resources. So both Nescent and SK call for new statistical methods to partition data on courtship behavior into its fertility and sexual selection components. Furthermore, with both definitions, sexual selection is restored to its status as a specific hypothesis for how selection shapes mating behavior, rather than as a far-reaching doctrine about sexual reproduction generally. So the Nescent and SK definitions do have points of disagreement. First, the Nescent definition sees mating as serving both social and reproductive roles, whereas the SK definition sees mating as a vehicle for access to gametes. Second, the Nescent definition sees selection as increasing fertilizations via negotiated and coordinated cooperation. This is illustrated in photos at the top of the slide for biparental care in albatrosses and penguins that I took near Antarctica in 2019. In contrast, the SK definition sees selection as sexual selection as winning at competition for mates. So both definitions define evolutionary success as an increase of genes in the gene pool. Okay, we all agree to that, but differ on the behavioral mechanisms used to attain that increase. And I think it's a mistake for SK to stipulate the word competition in their definition. The definition should be neutral about competition and cooperation. And so because the Nescent definition Nescent definition about the behavioral mechanism underlying sexual selection, let me say that again, because the Nescent definition is neutral about the behavioral mechanism underlying sexual selection, and the SK definition is not, the Nescent definition should, I think, be preferred to the SK definition. To stipulate competition as the mechanism of sexual selection, as SK has done, invites two rhetorical traps. First is the need to view cooperation as really competition in disguise. For example, claiming that two males are really just competing when offering different degrees of cooperation to a female. And this phrasing privileges competition over cooperation. Second is the need to specify an object of competition, which SK do, with a distinction between gametes and resources as objects of competition. More generally, I claim courtship behavior is not about competition for objects, but is a system for offering bids in the exchange of fitness, as the next slide illustrates. The Nescent report illustrates how to test whether behavior is cooperative or competitive in the context of models for specific situations. For example, consider a male who allocates time into helping a female produce eggs versus allocating time to guarding. And consider a female who allocates time into foraging versus being available for mating. The reproductive pie is the clutch of eggs. Fertility selection on the male favors increasing the size of the pie by helping the female. Sexual selection on the male favors increasing the fraction of the pie that he sires. The slide illustrates the male and female fitnesses resulting from all time commitments. So the horizontal axis here is the female fitness from different time allocations. This is the male fitness from different time allocations. And so the best suite of allocations is along the outer boundary here, some called the Pareto boundary. So the right edge of the envelope shows the boundary along which no win-win solutions are possible. What that means is that if you had an allocation, if both the male and the female had an allocation in here, they could both do better by moving to the right. But once they hit this boundary out here, nobody can move farther to the right than the boundary itself. So it can move up and down the boundary, in which case you give up one, and in which case increase in one results in a decrease of fitness in the other. So some compromise is needed along that boundary. So the best compromise of time allocations is at the green dot. Now the non-competitive, okay, so that's the best cooperative out. The non-competitive time allocations are at the red dot. So if neither does anything to help the other, you're down here. Now the threat of realizing the red dot motivates the male and female to find time allocations that attain the green dot. So hypothesize that during courtship, the male and the female communicate their preferred time allocations and adjust either their own time allocations accordingly or find other partners that do. If a model like this for a specific situation is made quantitative, then the predicted time allocations can be compared with the observed time allocations, thereby testing the existence of a cooperative versus competitive breeding arrangement. Furthermore, the exchange of physical pleasure provides a way to communicate the desired time allocations during courtship and to maintain or adjust those allocations afterwards. Thus, if the male and female are playing competitively with each other, the allocations should match the red dot and no affiliative interaction should occur. Conversely, if they are playing cooperatively with each other, their allocation should match the green dot and the cooperating pair should participate in continual affiliative interactions that impart a mutual exchange of pleasure to maintain the coordination needed for successful cooperation. I'd like to add that most birds are socially monogamous, perhaps as high as 95%, many of which provide biparental care to their chicks. So I predict that courtship in most birds is mostly about cooperation rather than competition. So many of my thoughts in this seminar trace to my book, Evolution's Rainbow, published 19 years ago in 2004. The book has sold well and has been translated into Korean, Portuguese, and Spanish. My sequel, The Genial Gene, was published 5 years ago, and 5 years later in 2009, and is also available in French. And I've published numerous articles on gender and sexuality up until 2017. But by that time, I felt I could do all I could on this topic and have moved on. For the last 5 years, my research has been on mathematical models for the evolution of the relationship between microbiomes and their hosts, called holobionts. And this is what I spoke about at noon. All in all, the future for sexual selection studies looks more promising now that the basic issue of sexual selection's definition is finally being seriously considered. And this will lead to more testable hypotheses and more convincing science. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.
Dr. Roughgarden. We have some time for questions. Does anyone have a question? I can run the microphone around so we can hear. You guys got this. Yeah, okay, coming. It's a good workout.
Love doing it. Hi, I'm Dr. Melinda Chen. I'm an assistant professor in women's and gender studies, and I had a question on how you define gender here, because I think so far what I was hearing was that it relates to gender expression, but I wonder, and also how it relates to gender roles, but I also wonder how like we think about gender identity in this context, if it's relevant at all.
We don't think about gender identity because the question would arise as to whether an animal has a sense of identity. Does the animal say, well, I am a this or I am a that? And I don't know, frankly. Animals can advertise their role in the sense of having colors that indicate whether they have a territory, or having the animals wear the colors in many cases as though they were a uniform, the way people will indicate their occupation, like a policeman will have a policeman's uniform, or a fireman will have a fireman's uniform. So there will be uniforms that are used to, that people use to designate their occupations. And the coloration sometimes that an animal has also indicates an occupation in the same sense. Now, I'm not aware of any species which would use its uniform, so to speak, as an expression of identity, as though it were an intent. And so I think that's my answer to your question, is that we don't think, or at least I don't think, about gender identity as much as gender realization. Thank you for coming, by the way.
Scared to use the mic. I can project.
There you go.
For like natural selection, the idea of competition has been pretty ingrained, and it makes sense in most facets. But do you think this idea of cooperation and sexual selection framework might have any sort of implications in other sort of natural processes of evolution? You know, when we know there are meerkats or other animals that do rely on altruism and more like family units increasing their gametes and their genes into the overall population. So have you considered, or has anyone considered, utilizing some of this cooperation in other evolutionary frameworks?
Well, yeah, there's, in some sense, there's a large literature now on cooperation. Usually extends from the premise that that what's primitive and what's natural is competition. So the question is one of how to reconcile cooperation where it occurs with what's essentially viewed as a competitive process. And oftentimes, though, accounts like that suffer from the presumption of the primitiveness of competition. And so if you take competition as a primitive, then you're stuck with how to reconcile any cooperation you see with that. But in this case, the question is whether it is in fact primitive. Because if we go back to the origin of sex, if that's cooperative to begin with, then there's nothing, we don't have to explain any competitiveness. It is cooperative to begin with, because it's an agreement between the two parties to mix genes, and they don't have to do that. They're perfectly capable of reproducing asexually, but that doesn't turn out to be a winning strategy over the long run. So, so I think that's the main issue. Is in most cooperation theory, is the starting point. And are you willing to take cooperation as the starting point rather than as something that only comes later under special circumstances? Yeah.
You wanna yell or use the mic?
Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering actually, in general, in animal, the mating between the same sex, how they affect the probability of their mating with the opposite sex. Like if, for example, like the animal, you show the lion in front of the female, the two male lion had mating actually. So I am wondering, is there any study that shows that, for example, mating between the same sex can decrease or increase the probability of mating with their opposite sex or not?
Not offhand. That would be very species specific, and you'd need a lot of behavioral data to know that. I don't know of any data of that sort, and I'm just a bit skeptical that it even exists because of how much work it would take to establish something like that. You'd have to establish that, say, a pair of lions mated a lot with one another, and then somehow compare that with a pair of lions that don't mate with each other, but they just mate with females, and then compare the mating frequency of those with the subsequent mating frequency of the two males that mated with each other. And that would take a lot of data. And so I'm skeptical that that even exists anywhere, but so I don't know.
Hello, I was just wondering if you could clarify a little bit on the graph or the chart that was used and where like is that chart theoretical or has it been observed in animals? And
This
if so-
chart?
Yes.
That's theoretical. So I
Okay.
suggest to ornithologists that they might want to do this.
And then my other question was going to be if there has been any studies, but
No.
if it's theoretical, got it.
No, I mean, it's very hard to get people to take cooperation seriously. And so this would be the way to test it. I mean, if you think it's competition everywhere, put your money where your mouth is and then go ahead and test an actual cooperation hypothesis.
I also have a question about the graph.
Great.
How do we incorporate? So you said this is particularly for birds who have a lot of parental care. I study fish who don't have parental care. So how would you incorporate these different levels of care if the goal or like part of this is communicating your desired level of time investment?
Well, I mean, you do have parental care in fish. So, I mean, I would take those species in which you take the seahorse, or take any number of those species in which the female lays the eggs in the territory and the male swims around all the time and fans it and that sort of thing. I mean,
But
most
for
parental
fish,
care in
yeah.
fish is by males, so you shouldn't be able to find that many. It shouldn't be that hard to find species.
But like a general gradient, even if I look at just things that provide parental care, like there are gradients of care, right? So like, is there a way to incorporate like a weighted? Like, should the shape be the same or?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you want to get serious with a fish, we could adapt. We could tailor this for the specifics of the species you had in mind and the circumstances, because again, the notion of affiliative behavior I'm thinking of in terms of primarily birds and mammals. Now, I don't know how fish, so to speak, feel pleasure by touching each other or whatever they do to exchange physical pleasure or exchange pleasure. And I am assuming that fish do have a sense of pleasure, which I suppose even might be argued by some. But they would have to have some method of coordination. And so in any case, because the fish would have to swim back to the territory, and then they might have to do some little dance or something like that. some way to bring about the coordination. But yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
yeah.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I appreciate it very much. I'd just like you to clarify for me what you see the relationship between the evolution of cooperation and the evolution of altruism question, right? Given that at least traditionally the evolution of altruism question does derive from under what circumstances can other regarding behavior evolve through competition, if I understand, right? Or, so would you say that there is a relationship, or are you saying that the evolution of altruism question is kind of just a sideline because it's so grounded in competition?
Well, as I sort of mentioned earlier, I'm not sure it's always well posed because it is, as you just said, it begins with the supposition that competition has to be something to be overcome. And so some special population structure or some kind of other device has to be devised to get around the competition. But so I'm not too keen on that literature, frankly, and because it's a question of how the question's posed, and it presupposes too much to ask the question the way it's asked. Am I answering your question, or is there something else you're getting at?
I think you are. So can you just say how much sex presupposed? I think I know what you mean, right, in terms of the different philosophical altruism, biology. Say too much
Well, first of all, I mean, what's being presupposed at the very least is that cooperation needs to be explained. Now, possibly competition needs to be explained. Okay, maybe competition is a failure to cooperate, and that cooperation is primitive. So if you turn the whole thing on its head, you know, and just be willing to go there, and because in the case of the evolution of sex, now there's kinds of altruism that have nothing to do with sex. All right, so food sharing and various things, and the stuff, you know, modeled in multi-level selection a lot. It has nothing to do with sex. So I'm just talking about cooperation in the connection with sex. So if you start from the premise that cooperation, that sex itself is cooperative, then if you have phenomena like battles of sexes, then that would be a derived case situation, and you'd ask what it was that broke down, that gave rise to the possibility of a battle of the sexes, or a battle of the gametes, as Parker puts it. So that's the key thing. Is what's being presupposed is the primitiveness of competition. Now, if it's competition for resources, I mean, I don't have a problem with that, and you know, there is a carrying capacity, and nothing grows forever. So the reality of competition is not at issue here. The reality of competition with respect to sex is another matter. And yeah.
So we probably have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Wendy Millett. I'm actually in the religious studies department, so this is not my field, but I do like to study animal studies and religion, so I'm really interested in your talk.
Well,
But
thank you
one
for
of
coming. Yeah.
One of the, I'm really interested in the way your cooperation, right, is disrupting certain kind of assumptions, right, we talked about with competition. But I'm curious about, you know, when you're talking about affiliative behaviors, about pleasure, how do you suggest that scientists disrupt the kind of assumption of the productive quality of behaviors, a kind of teleological kind of valuing of pleasure as necessarily towards an end, such as, you know, like, does that make sense? How do you disrupt some of those kind of assumptions that are built in to even a framework like cooperation and sexual selection?
Yeah, fair enough. So I'm coming at it as an evolutionary biologist, and so I'm still committed, as such, I'm committed to an adaptive or functional argument. So, so I am than reconciling or finding a way to understand the behaviors as still being adaptive, but that what's adaptive is to be cooperative and with regard to sex. And so if it's competitive or if there's a lot of conflict, then why is that occurring? So it's still an explanation in an evolutionary framework, and I'm committed to that. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, in a moment, we'll thank Dr. Roughgarden, but first, I just want to announce that we do have a reception in the foyer of the museum as you walk out. If you're interested in sticking around, we'll be hanging out and socializing with Dr. Roughgarden out in the foyer. But once again, let's give a warm thank you to our speakers.